Hello, friends. Registration for next year's Exiles in Babylon conference is now open, and I cannot wait for this conference. Here are some topics we're going to wrestle with: the future of the church, disability in the church, multi-ethnic perspectives on American Christianity, and a dialogical debate on the problem of evil and suffering. We're still finalizing some of our speakers, but so far we've got Matt Chandler, Eugene Cho, Greg Boyd. He's going to be engaging in the dialogical debate on the problem of evil with Clay Jones from Talbot School of Theology. We've got Lamar Hardwick and Devin Stahl talking about disability. Michelle Sanchez from the ECC is going to be talking about the future of the church. Anna Ross is going to give her perspective on a Native American perspective on American Christianity. And of course, we've got Ellie Bonilla and Street Hymns backed by popular demand, along with Tanika Wyatt and Evan Wickham, who will be leading our multi-ethnic worship service again. And I can't believe there's another and we're going to have a pre-conference, a scholarly conversation about women in ministry featuring, Lynn Cohick, Scott McKnight, a couple other complementarian scholars who they're going to be dialoguing with. And I'm currently solidifying the details on that, so stay tuned. So March 23rd to 25th, 2023 here in Boise, Idaho. We sold out last year, so we'll probably sell out next year as well. So register sooner than later if you plan on coming. You can always attend virtually if you can't make it in person. All the info is at theologyintheraw.com. That's theologyintheraw.com. Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. My guest today is an old friend, Dr. Ryan Peterson. We taught together at Cedarville University many years ago and have been friends ever since. He's a really good dude, really down-to-earth guy, super smart. He has a Ph.D. from Wheaton College in theology, a master's degree from University of Edinburgh, and a master's degree from Biola University. He is an Associate Professor of Theology at Talbot Talbot School of Theology and Biola University, and is also the author of The Imago Dei as Human Identity, a Theological Interpretation, which is the subject of his Ph.D. dissertation. In this episode, I wanted to talk about Ryan about the whole concept of identity. I know this is something that Christians often talk about our identity is in Christ. What is identity? Who are we? Why are we here? And Ryan brings a lot of knowledge from the interaction between theology, philosophy, and the social sciences. And so he sent me a few articles on human identity from a sociological perspective, which were really fascinating. So I said, hey, I would love to have you on the podcast to help me navigate this conversation from a sociological perspective as it interacts with questions around sexuality and gender. So please welcome to the show for the first time, the one and only Dr. Ryan Peterson. Every now and then I have on guests who are scholars who are also friends of mine, and Ryan is certainly of that number. We both entered into Cedarville University as brand new professors. What year was that, Ryan?
2007.
7. You had just finished your PhD at Wheaton, right?
I was actually still writing my dissertation. Yeah,
That's
so
right.
I think I finished that 3 years into my time at Cedarville. Yeah.
It took you 3 years.
All those new classes.
Oh my gosh.
Crazy.
Well, that's the biggest fear is like when you're applying for a job in your ABD, all but dissertation. Yeah. Schools are like, we need this thing done, and the candidate's always like, all I have to do is just edit the last chapter, like I'm just about done. But it's people like you that cause institutions to say, yeah, we've heard that song and dance before. How long were you at Cedarville? I left in 2009. You were there another year?
Yeah. I was there 7 years. And
7 years.
Then went to Moody Bible Institute Spokane campus for a year. And then made my way down here to Talbot.
Wait, I guess I maybe knew that. A year at the Spokane, and that campus isn't there anymore, right? The Moody.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that was crazy. But it was a really wonderful year, actually. It was a great time. Students, it was like, a small campus. We met in a church, and all of the students had to live in rented housing. So they were just living in the community,
wow.
Not being able to go into a cafeteria and have someone wash their dishes for them. Like they had to do all their own work. And so there's like a different sense of like learning to live as Christian adults, in that context. So it was a really wonderful year. And then it's been awesome being here.
How long, when did you come to Talbot then? So
2015.
2015. Now, okay. So you've been there, 7-8 years. Are you full professor yet or?
No, I'm associate,
Okay.
and actually I'm up for my tenure review with the board coming up here in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
And so yeah, that's kind of the stage of things that I'm at. I just became co-chair of the graduate theology department with Rob
Oh,
Price, and yeah, so that's where I'm at here.
with Rob?
Yeah, Rob. Yeah, he's great, and so we love working together.
Rob, when we moved to Aberdeen in the middle of January, from California to Aberdeen, Scotland in January with a 7-month-old kid, we stayed at Rob's place, his little flat, for like 2 weeks while we were looking for houses. So, yeah,
amazing.
what a good dude.
So you have that overlapping. Yeah, when we think about our time hanging out with you for those couple of years while you were at Cedarville, regularly we think about the fact that Mercy had just been born when we moved there, and you already had some kids,
right?
So our oldest is now 15.
Oh wow!
And we were over at you guys' place, and every time anyone would like take a bite of food, she'd just cry, and Chris was like, I think she's hungry, guys. So we're like, oh, okay. And so she'd never eaten anything, yeah. And so we're like, all right, let's try some stuff. And then she just ate it, was so excited. And
I didn't even know that, really. So
yeah, the first time my daughter ate solid food was at your house.
Oh, that's hilarious. Well, we could go down memory lane all the whole podcast, and we'd probably lose the audience after a couple of minutes. In the work that I do with sexuality and gender, the question of identity comes up obviously all the time. And and you've done a lot of work on identity from just more of a can I say theological, sociological level even. And I remember some interactions we had where I'm like, hey, what do you think about this? And you just gave me such helpful insight from a sociological perspective. And then a few months ago, you sent me these articles, and it's one of them. Apparently, in the world of sociology, has been a pretty well-known or groundbreaking or article.
Yeah, I think it's been influential in certain circles. I mean, it hasn't. We'll talk about the ways that it hasn't carried the day, but
okay. It's called Beyond Identity, and it's by Rogers Brubaker, who's a pretty well-known sociologist. I read a book. He wrote a book on trans and racial identities, which is really good. And co-authored with Frederick Cooper. I don't know who that is.
He's at NYU, a historian.
Okay.
And he does history of Africa and stuff like that.
Okay. And then you sent me a book chapter you wrote called Created and Constructed Identities in Theological Anthropology from a more theological perspective. Here's what I want to do. I would love for you to give us for somebody who's completely unaware of the last 40 years of conversations on what is identity in sociological research, can you give us just a basic kind of overview for the people like me that are very unfamiliar with that territory?
Sure, I'll try. I mean, it is all over the place. Part of the argument that Brubaker and Cooper make is that really the term is very ambiguous because people use it in so many different ways. So maybe I can kind of lay out the different ways that it's used, and then also mention the ways that sometimes it's conflated. That's a big part of their argument, is like oftentimes people shift from one meaning to another without sort of doing so explicitly. And it's fine in terms of the way that people are self-describing, but it becomes a problem when you use it as a category for analysis because you're trying to analyze something with an ambiguous term.
Right.
So that's where it gets tough. But anyway, so like if I were to kind of lay out a spectrum of ways that the term identity is used, classically, so way before the last 40 years or 60 years, there's kind of some, the term identity had to do with like the thing that's most stable about your existence, right? This is what remains the same. And normally it had to do primarily with your nature. So the fact that you're a human being and that is there's a nature sort of aimed at particular ends, and that remains the same throughout your life, no matter what ebbs and flows elsewhere, no matter what new relationships you enter into. It's always sort of on this trajectory towards these certain goods. Mm-hmm. So there's like a kind identity or a natural identity like that. And then there's a personal identity. So in philosophy, by far the way that the term identity, the most common way, has been to talk about the way that you remain the same, even though everything in you changes, like the ship of Theseus kind of example from ancient philosophy. But it's like, okay, so if you have the ship of Theseus and over time replace all the parts, is it still the same ship? And people have compared that to our bodies, right? That like, other than a few cells, I think, in our eyes, our cells are constantly, we're shedding cells that have died and creating new ones. So all of our parts are different materially, and yet we're the same person across time. And so in the philosophical discussion, they primarily tried to explain that, like, how do we remain the same person, even though all of our parts are changing? But in starting probably actually in the 19th century, so with Freud and some others, they started to use the identity language to talk more about psychological self-understanding. So like, who do I think that I am?
Okay.
And why do I think that I am who I am, and so on. So like, not like those more concrete nature identity or personal identity, like baby Preston is still the same person as 45-year-old Preston or whatever. But now it's like your own self-understanding is changing all the time, right? So, who you thought you would be when you were 5 and who you are now, like, you're thinking about yourself in totally different ways. And so this is a radically changing kind of concept of identity, where it really is connected to self-interpretation, self-understanding, and so on. So that's one of the ways that it kind of got picked up in the psychological literature. And then in sociological literature, they've tied it to the changing social context that we find ourselves in. So, let's say you grow up in the middle of Iowa in a small town there, and then you move to Los Angeles, and like, your social context has changed, the relationships have totally changed how you're thinking about yourself within your social context, and so on. And so again, it's a very fluid concept based on social relationships. So some social psychologists, for example, have basically said, look, a baby is born with no identity. They don't have an identity until they have some kind of social relationships in which to interpret their own life, and from which other people are interpreting their life as well. So kind of like the term identity has both a internal self-understanding notion, but then also a sense of like, how do other people think about you? So we're really talking about a spectrum going from these sort of concrete, strong realities that make you who you are on the one hand, and then like these very fluid and flexible terms that basically either have to do with your own self-determination, like, I want to be such and such and therefore I am, or you're sort of digging inside of yourself for kind of a psychological understanding of why you are the way you are. So really that's a very fluid, flexible, changing sense of identity. And that's really how our culture has picked it up. So that's where now, even though that's a much more recent kind of way of using the term, that's definitely the most common way in all the popular
if I remember correctly, and whatever you read outside your main field of discipline, it's harder literature to read. So this article by Brubaker, Rogers, such a cool name, Rogers.
Rogers.
Brilliant. It's not the easiest. It's a slow read because he's kind of summing up kind of the state of literature. But if I remember, and please correct me if I'm not summarizing it correctly, but it seems like him and Cooper, their main beef in this article written 20 years ago, which is fascinating, is that the concept of identity has become so fluid and ill-defined and inconsistently used that if everything's kind of identity, then it's not a helpful concept anymore. They even say, this is on page 1, if identity is everywhere, then it's nowhere. Like, it's it seems like they're kind of protesting how many different things can become someone's identity, so that this concept of identity is just no longer useful. Is that Is that a helpful
Yeah,
quick
I think
summary?
that's
And can you
exactly
expand on what? I didn't finish the article. It's a long article, and I really wanted to finish it before this interview, and I didn't get to it. But I probably read maybe half of it. It is really, really insightful. And one of the main things they keep playing on is this essentialist, constructionalist kind of interplay. You know, like essentialist would be kind of the objective, like we are human, whether we want to be or not. We are. Well, this is going to become controversial. Well, it's controversial. It's only been controversial in the last few years, but you know, I am male or I am female. These are objective. Whether we want to be or not, these are objective state of being. I am 46. I am 5'11". But then they said now that there's this constructional. What's the best way to say that? There's constructionist.
Yeah.
Okay, where you know, get your social environment or even your subjective state of, you know, identifying. I am this because I say I am this. You know, and it's just become utterly from an academic standpoint, a sociological standpoint, it's kind of rendered this concept of identity useless.
Yeah. That's right. That's what they're arguing.
Okay.
And they were doing this 22 years ago, which was relatively tame compared to the ways that the term identity is used now, of course.
Yeah.
And so basically what they were saying was that it's rendered useless as a category for analyzing any phenomena in culture. Right? Okay. So like to say, like you said, let's say I said Preston has a white male American identity.
Right.
Well, the problem is that could be just a descriptor of sort of your social location.
Okay. Or
it could be that I'm trying to describe the values that you embrace and live from, right? Like, because the word identity means both of those things. So it could just be that I'm describing a fixed reality about who, you know, your being. Mm-hmm. Or it could be that this is like your intentional effort to live in the world is to say, I want to have American values, you know, like I'm going to shoot some guns and, you know, the stuff that you love.
You know me.
Right, exactly. So there it's like, so the idea is that the term isn't helpful for analyzing who you are and what your social location is and what values you hold and why you hold them and so on. Yeah. Because if I use the term identity, no one knows which aspect of your life I'm actually referring to.
Are there people in the scholarly field of, I guess, sociology or psychology that would really disagree with Brubaker and Cooper and think that, like, no, we think that the way identity is used today is very helpful and, you know...
Yeah, I think that's probably the dominant view.
Okay.
For the kind of usage in the social sciences, mainly because it's just become the means by which we talk about something being valued by the person and also a result of their social context. So when in, let's say, the handbook of self and identity, which is just like, I think it's in its second or third edition, and it's kind of the standard handbook in psychology. Like it's even in the title, right? Self and identity, because the idea is that they find that to be useful for both understanding self-interpretation and also for that social constructivism. So the sense that, like, yeah, you are the product of your culture, and that conditions everything about who you are and why you live the way that you do, and so on. And so it's a good way of, or at least it's become sort of a popular way of describing how all of our life is conditioned by our social context.
Right.
Now, the problem, I mean, I think the reason I sent you the Brubaker and Cooper article is I think they raise all the right questions about that dynamic. It's like they're just saying there's better terms for analyzing that reality, and identity just confuses things. And I think that it does, because what they do, they point out that, like, those, so when someone says, let's say that they have certain sexual identity. It's hard to know. They might talk about the way that sexuality is fluid, and therefore it's a weak concept of identity, right? It's like something that can change at any moment based on other factors and so on. But they're also saying that it's something intrinsic to them. So they're actually kind of lending from the stronger essentialist definitions to sort of argue for why people ought to accommodate it. It's because it's so essential to who they are. And so they're sort of, people are flexing back and forth between the essentialist support for weak and fluid definitions of identity. And at least that's the claim that they're making, is that those get conflated, and it makes it difficult then to actually assess the real factors are in play.
What, and I'm sure I'm obviously interested in the conversation because it's a huge part of the sexuality, gender conversation. So I'm sure we'll dig into that a bit more. And I would love, I'm typically thinking about it beginning with kind of a theology of sexuality and gender, and then kind of looking at some of the identity conversation outside of that conversation. I would love to almost hear from you, who's kind of coming at it from the different direction. I would love, so your article, Created and Constructed Identities in Theological Anthropology, I would love to hear your analysis of this whole thing. Like, how do you think the concept of identity is being used? Is that helpful? Is it unhelpful? What is the best way we should think through identity? I imagine your article touches on that. Can you give us an overview of kind of your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, sure. So one of the observations I try to make is that constructed identities, and if we're talking, just to give some kind of context for that, things like racial or ethnic, national, religious, gender, sexual identities, all of those kind of things are different from biblical categories of identity, which actually work around theological categories such as being a creature, being in a covenantal relationship with God, being redeemed from sin, and also, kind of an eschatological fulfillment. So we get these really interesting biblical insights in, about Paul's self-understanding from Galatians 2, 20 and 21, right? Where he's basically saying, he's died and it's no longer he who lives, but Christ lives in him. Or in Colossians 3, when it talks about how we have died and our lives are hidden in Christ with God, that there's this sense, or with Christ in God, that there's this sense that our identity is actually tied up with Christ. And that's so different from what we mean by identity in this social scientific sense. And so part of my interest was trying to bring those into conversation with each other to say, okay, so what would a theological account of identity look like, so that we could begin to interface with these other cultural concepts?
Do you think it's helpful to talk in terms of like a primary identity and then secondary identities? So like primary identity, as I think about myself, I'm human, I'm male, I'm a Christian. Those are kind of all three inseparable, I would say. Which one's more important? Well, my humanity or my Christian? It's kind of hard to, they kind of are both wrapped up in each other. Secondary identities, I am a husband and father. I am straight. I live in America. These are not insignificant. I mean, the fact that I'm a husband and a father has there's few moments throughout the day where that aspect of my life isn't significant on some level, whether it's 5:30 and I'm still at the coffee shop and I'm late to taking my kid to his baseball practice, or I had a fight with my wife last night that's unresolved, and the next morning I'm still lingering. There's still second, or is that even the right way to categorize it? Secondary, primary, because it just seems almost cliched saying it, but I mean, people say my ultimate identity is in Christ. everything else is kind of secondary. But is that helpful? I mean, or maybe and I don't. These are all genuine questions, by the way. I'm not like asking leading questions. Like maybe when I talk about husband and father, I shouldn't even use the category of identity to describe that, or I don't know. What do you? Yeah, does that make sense? I'm kind of rambling a bit.
It does. Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And actually, this is where when we talk about finding our identity in Christ or something like that, where it can become really either insightful or very problematic, and from my perspective. So, oftentimes, what we mean when we say things like that is that we've accepted sort of a constructivist account of identity, and we're just saying that the life I'm constructing is based on my belief about Jesus or something like that, which isn't bad. Obviously, I think Christians should construct their lives in a way that is based on their belief in Jesus. But it's accepting the idea that their identity is determined by their self-determination, right? It's like, I've chosen this for myself. I understand myself, like Jesus is out there and I'm going to set a course for my life, and that life is going to be somehow it just so happens I could have chosen anything, but I'm kind of setting this course for my identity. Like, I think that is a problematic use of the term identity because of the way that, those passages that I mentioned there with Paul, he's kind of saying that, like, his identity isn't located in what he's determined for himself, but rather the other way around, that Christ has determined a certain identity for him. And now he's like learning that, living into it, and so on. So it's it's more a matter of discovering an identity rather than determining an identity and things like that. So I think that it can become problematic when, I think this comes out maybe in a lot of, like with my students right now, one of the biggest things that they're facing in their churches is they're interacting with people who are struggling with the traditional evangelical sort of upbringing that they've had, and they're becoming ex-evangelicals, and this kind of thing. And they're trying to figure out, how do we pastor people who are in the middle of deconstructing their faith and these kind of things. And part of the thing is that they're the people in the middle of this deconstruction are often still thinking of themselves as determining their own identity and they're still constructing a new identity in place of the old one, rather than thinking that their identity is determined by these theological realities that then would help them to both critique and revise and reform, like the faith that they were brought up in, but that there'd be some kind of anchor in theological truths.
Interesting. I have so many questions along sexuality and gender lines, but I don't want to just hijack the conversation. But so I'm curious about you. So you've really marinated yourself in the identity conversation, both on a theological, psychological level. When you think about the climate of sexuality and gender, what are some questions you have from coming at it from the identity coming at it from the perspective of, thinking about the scholarly discussion of identity?
Yeah, what I've tried to do in that article, and what I've been working on since as well, so I hope to write some more on this in the near future. But what I was trying to say is that there are these sort of creation-related anchors for understanding why human life takes the form that it does, why human experience takes the form that it does. But then there's also the reality of self-understanding, self-construction, and so on. And we don't want to sort of deny either end of this process. Yeah. And it seems to me that a lot of times people who are kind of traditionalist or essentialist want to say that whole journey of self-understanding and the challenges of trying to make sense of who you are in the world, and maybe even questions you have about the way that your body and who you are actually, whether they fit or not, and questions about which relationships will actually help you to flourish and which ones won't, and questions about like what vocations you ought to have in life and all that. Mm-hmm. Like those things, there is a radical kind of fluid journey that people are on in navigating those things. And so just because they are anchored, in my view, in these theological realities doesn't mean that the person in that journey isn't experiencing them as a changing and fluid reality. Right. And so we have to kind of say both of those things are true. And then that raises a whole bunch of questions about sort of what are identity features or aspects of self-understanding related to the big questions in sexuality and gender, and I think race, and even nationalism and these kind of things, where people are saying, hey, this is who I am. I am like my life is dictated by these aspects of experience.
See, that statement right there is fascinating. This is who I am. But then your second statement, my life is dictated.
Yes.
It's kind of like the Enneagram, why some people hate the Enneagram, right? It's like, well, I'm an Enneagram 4. And it's like people get nervous. Like, so you're just going to be confined to this kind of somebody else's description of who you are and always will be and can never change and accept me for who I am. You know, I love it. I think it's super helpful when it's seen in the right perspective, any kind of personality test, but they can get off the rails a little bit of not just this is who I am, but this is also going to dictate who I always will be, how I will behave.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I've found Augustine to be really helpful in all of this. Like I was shocked at how much, just going back, I was teaching a class on theological anthropology with Matt Jensen here last semester, and we were reading a bunch of Augustine in there, but how often he's talking about the changeable, mutable reality of our nature, that we really are, we can be drawn in kind of any direction and build a whole life in any of these sort of diverse array of sort of ways based on different desires and loves that we have. But then how he says that actually it's the anchor of God, God kind of anchoring that our loves and desires that ought to then kind of provide a trajectory for a life well lived, right? And so it's interesting that he's recognizing in classical theological anthropology both of these realities, that we can construct lives in lots of different ways. This isn't like a new discovery. People have always known it. But the question is how, what should sort of be the telos or the goal that sort of draws life towards itself. And, Augustine's going to say that's God, and then the fixed realities of God's character that our character more and more into that image. But I'm interested to know from you, because I mean you're out there talking about these things all the time in super helpful ways. I love your stuff. My students all love your stuff as well. And so your name gets brought up every semester in class and in conversations with students. So they're really benefiting from the work you're doing. But like, how is this discussion of identity hitting in the discussions that you're having on sex?
I'm in kind of an in-between space on a lot of the identity questions, because I am where do I start? Okay, let's talk about let me start here. Teenagers, when it comes to gender especially, we know there's just dozens and dozens of gender identities, and some of the main ones would be non-binary, trans, genderqueer, gender fluid would probably be the top 4 that I come across with teens. And parents who are either Gen Xers or grandparents that are boomers, when they hear their teen kind of use these identities, they freak out, right? They're like, what the heck, And my as I try to pastor the parent, my number one piece of advice is don't freak out. Don't freak out. Be inquisitive. Be curious. Get to know what your kid means by that identity, not in an interrogative an interrogative way, not in a cynical way, not in a eye roll, but like be genuinely curious. Not so much about the term, but like, what are they trying to describe about their experience,
Exactly.
you know? And I often use this phrase and would love your feedback. You know, I said, you know, for a lot of teens, these identity markers are a way to name an experience that they're currently going through. Now, even by the way I word that can be taken, people are like, what do you mean currently going through? This is who they are and who they always will be. I said, no, you should never use the phrase who they are and who they always will be with a 15-year-old, period. Okay, just don't ever use that phrase if you want to have a scientifically based conversation. But I also don't want to say just because it's an experience they're currently going through or whatever doesn't mean it's insignificant. My word, you take yourself back to, Ryan, the first girl who broke your heart at 15. You know, I mean, have you experienced like deep, dark depression where you didn't want to leave your room? Now, 5 seconds later you got over it. Well, a week later, but like during the moment, that was an all-consuming experience that was more important than your skin. It was. That's right. So I want to balance, like when I say don't freak out over the identity. Do identities change? Can identities change? Of course they can change. Like for people that like tiptoe around that, like I don't know, of course they can. Like these are ways that a teenager are naming their experience. So I want to help the parent to like have a deep appreciation and honor the experience with while not freaking out like, oh my gosh, when my 13-year-old says they're non-binary, they're going to be saying the same thing when they're 85 years old. Like, well, maybe there'll be 85-year-old women saying they're, still identifying as non-binary, or maybe not. Like these are ways of naming an experience. These are not as, and now if the parent has like a Ph.D, I might say, these identities aren't maybe as ontologically significant and stable as they might feel to the person in the moment. You don't say that. First of all, they wouldn't understand what you mean. But I mean, relax. Look through the identity, get to know the person who just invited you into their experience. What do you think about that?
I think that's like incredibly on point as pastoral advice. And I think as well that it fits the psychological and sociological literature really well because like I mentioned, in those fields, you're really not dealing with an ontological thing. You're dealing with a person's self-understanding, which of course is
fluid,
changing. It's always changing. Yes. It's always adapting and all of this kind of stuff. So you're not like naming the most essential part of the person. What you're saying is this is what their life feels like in this moment. And we're going to help them sort of live in healthy ways in light of that experience, right? And like you said, I think your example is great. Going back to anyone's sort of early teenage years, the things that stand out as by far the most vital aspects of life are something that 20 years later, you're going to totally recalibrate like the place that those experiences have in life and so on. But at the moment, how could you think otherwise, right?
Right. Yeah. And here's where it gets really confusing, both for the kid, for the teen, for people even talking about, especially gender, is sometimes the categories that, well, let me just try to think about how to frame it. Let me just jump into it and I'll frame it after. Like male, female. These are two of, as in biological sex. I use male, female to refer to biological sex. Probably next to just simply being human, if it's even inseparable from being human. These are two of the most stable, objectively stamped identities that humans have. Where it gets confusing is when we move over to the more the self-understanding realm. The terms male and female can be used both of the objective, unchangeable thing, but also a self-understanding. Why I don't identify? I ask somebody, "What do you mean? What do you mean by non-binary? Why don't fully identify as male or female?" They're using what their if you ask them to define male and female in that sentence, it's going to mean something more along the lines of gender expression, gender stereotypes.
That's right.
But they're borrowing categories from something that's the most. It's not. I mean, in a science, if you just think scientifically, that phrase "I don't identify as" or "I do identify as male." Like if I said, "Ryan, yeah, I identify as male," that doesn't make sense if I'm talking about. I'm blurring two very different categories of self-understanding versus objectively stamped upon me, regardless of whether I think I am or not. In the gender conversation, this is where it gets utterly confusing. Is really it comes down to a lot of just terminological confusion. And this is where pastorally, again, don't freak out. There's a lot of just terminological confusion going on. That's not the primary. We can work through that later. The number one thing is you have a human being standing in front of you who's trying to sort out important life experiences, would you agree with that? I mean, am I framing that right? Like, how would you word it? Like objectively, objective identities that don't care about whether you feel that way or not versus our subjective responses to maybe some of these objective identities.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I might talk about it in terms of like concrete phenomena of the person's body or their biology, right?
Okay.
And then their experience, their interpretation of that experience, and the ways that they're navigating that. So one thing I haven't mentioned yet, I guess, in terms of even within the psychological literature, two different paths, both on the constructivist side, is that like there are some features even beyond the biological that are fairly stable. And there's a lot of literature showing that, right? So like personality features. So there's things that you can identify, and you know this from having kids, like you see them at 6 months old, and then you see them at 16 years old, and you're like, wow, I can like draw, see the thread of development. Like there's things about their formation that is adaptive, but also their personality features are actually stable over time. So there's a lot of literature sort of on that side of things. But then on the constructivist self-interpretation side, so it's like whether you interpret yourself this way or not just your body, but even your personality has consistencies that they can identify and predict future behavior and all of this kind of stuff. It gets kind of scary because it's almost like they can say, oh yeah, this percentage of people will make these kinds of decisions, this percentage, and then that it works out that way, and it's like, wow, what's going on where there's actually these kind of predictable trajectories of development because of stable realities in the person. But then, like you're talking about, the person's individual sort of experience of what teenager in some ways isn't confused about sexuality and relationship and needs mentoring through all of that, and needs a lot of grace and love and people listening to them, no matter what, like whether it's that they kind of fall in what would be considered more traditional sort of pathways or not. The thing is everyone's confused about like, how does this actually work out? How do these relationships become healthy rather than like you said, heartbreak, and everything else. So it was like, I think that pastoral insight is huge. I think the other question about the conflation of the stable with the fluid is really the big, but I brought that up on the psychology side mainly to say even personality features are far more stable than we might think. And so self-interpretation is really fluid, but actual personality aspects can be stable. They do change, but mostly along trajectories of development, not along like radical conversion to a different personality.
Yeah, you know who I first came across that with reading Steven Pinker. I'm trying to think of the book. I've read a few of his books. I'm looking over at my bookshelf. There's one he wrote like 20 years ago, and I remember him talking about that like, he says, there's a spectrum of, even there, like fluid constructionalist kind of view on this and more essentialist. And he definitely takes way more on the essentialist all the way to the point to where like he's even talking about parenting, and I really like Pinker. Most of the stuff he says, I'm like, yeah, that seems, I don't know, seems right. But even I was like, basically saying like, and I don't quote me on this, but I mean like, parents, your kids you can't really do much to change your kids' kind of behavior or personality. Like they're going to be who they are. Like, I mean, he's a very pretty much anti-Christian. So I mean, he has zero room in his for like the spirit, doing some kind of work. But, but yeah, I wouldn't have said that before. I think now I do think personalities are, I would say, more stable than people realize. So that's interesting. So that's not an objective kind of state of, it's not on par with like being human or male and female, and yet it still has a stability. Even sexuality, sexual attraction. And this is, so I think when we talk about fluidity, I think everybody gets, or a lot of people get super nervous because they don't want to be advocating for like ex-gay therapy, making gay people straight, changing people's sexual orientation. And I'm on the front lines of also not wanting to go there. And yet we can still talk about sexual fluidity without talking about orientation change. I mean, there's been a lot of work done, especially on female sexuality. That's pretty well established now. Like few people I know in the field would question that female sexuality is incredibly fluid. Doesn't mean that you just wake up one day and choose who you're attracted to. What it does mean is, for whatever reason, human adult females, their sexuality is fairly significantly affected by their social environment. And that's just, social environment has layers and layers and layers and layers to it, both one-on-one relationships as they get older, as they interact with men and women and different socioeconomic geographical locations. And Lisa Diamond is one of the most well-known people who has done work on this, and she traced 100 non-straight women over a period of 10 years. So non-straight, they all identified as, all over the map, but none of them said they're straight. And over 10 years, something like 3% of them had the same identity every 2 years over the 10-year period. None of them went from like fully opposite sex attracted to fully same sex attracted, but there was a lot of fluidity within kind of a general orientations. And now there's been more studies being done on like male sexuality is more fluid than we realize. And certainly with something like gender is such a nebulous concept, but like if it has something to do with how we think through and respond to our biological sex, goodness, I of course that's going to be affected by our social environment, even though that's so unpopular to say in some circles. I mean, I think the average person is like, yeah, totally, but like can't say that on like social media, but
right, exactly. But as soon as you do some traveling, spend time in different cultures, like you just realize that people are constructing what it means to be a man and a woman in lots of different ways in different cultures. There are sort of themes that arise, but in terms of the particularities of like what that means for life decisions, the roles that people ought to play, obviously culture is playing a huge role in shaping that. And that's where I think the disruption of the cultural norms in America is causing a lot of confusion, right? Just because we actually are intentionally saying, let's get away from the norms of a previous age, and nothing very solid has taken its place yet, right? And so we're in a place where people are like, well, what does it mean to be a man? And the answer is, can't really tell you, because that would be to rig the game, or what does it mean to be a woman? And so like here we've got, a situation where we have a whole lot of adolescents who are trying to learn models, but we're constantly also undermining by saying you shouldn't follow these models because actually they're oppressive or whatever. And so we're culturally trying to kind of create a new state of affairs.
Interesting.
So that's going to be like, and that could be bad. It could be, I mean, I'm not trying to assess that fully right now. I'm just trying to say that I think is where a lot of confusion is coming from.
What are some questions your students are asking along the lines of sexuality and gender when you start talking about identity? Like, does this come up in class quite a bit?
Oh yeah, it comes up a ton. I mean, in their churches, most of so we have just an amazing and diverse student body, but even with all of the diversity, Southern California diversity here, and our Talbot student body, it's like they all have these same kind of challenges in their churches related to sexuality and gender, and the questions around this, mainly because as people are becoming Christians, let's say it's a gay couple that joins the church, and then they're starting to get involved in church ministry and so on. There's all kinds of questions about, like, how do we, like, what levels of, leadership and involvement and all of this are we sort of open to as a church related to this dynamic. And then also, like, what does discipleship look like then for a gay couple in the congregation, as they're trying to say, this is what it means to follow Jesus for the next 20 years. Like, what are the things that the church ought to advise for their relationship and for their walk with Christ, which I think it's such a complex and difficult thing. I mean, you're talking about this all the time, so you probably have some great answers to that question.
Yeah, well,
that's definitely what they're struggling with. And then the same thing on the gender front. So you've got people who start attending church who are gender fluid, and they're getting involved more, not only with small groups, but, families hanging out maybe with the children in church and so on. And so that makes more traditionalist families nervous, because it's like, well, now our kids are learning from a model that isn't really what we want to support. So it's all questions of the nitty gritty of what do we do to sort of integrate everyone into the church community and allow everyone to play a role in the ministry that we have, but also shepherd our young people well, and all of that. Those are at least the big questions that
I think there's two big ones for me when it comes to sexuality and gender that I think the church some environmental things that the church should be aware of. Number one is how the church reinforces gender stereotypes. I remember years ago talking to a gay guy. He was a former worship leader at a church, came out as gay. They kicked him out of the church. And but he said, he was a convert. Like, he got saved as a late teenager, and a little more on the feminine side of things. But he says, I never questioned whether I was a man or not until I got to church. Like these real rigid things, like if you're a man, you drive a big truck, you go to men's retreats, and these stereotypes are just exacerbated. And it was like, oh, so to be a Christian is to be this kind of stereotypical masculine man. God, how sad is that? That it wasn't until he got to the church when he questioned whether he was a real man or not. So I think the church should be aware of that. And also, the church, we always bemoan how sexualized our culture is, our secular culture, which is true, totally true. But I think we play a role in that by idolizing marriage and sex. Our one footnote to the idolization of sex is wait till marriage, but we do have an underlying kind of message that you can't really flourish as a human unless you're married and having sex with the person you desire. And then we turn around the gay people who want to follow Jesus and says, but you can't get married and have sex with the person you desire. It's like, and that's when my affirming friends will say, yeah, we need to change the second part. I'm like, well, let's change the first part. Let's not give the message that you can't really survive until you're married to the person that you sexually desire. Like, that's the fundamental problem. So I've heard people ask me, and how viable is something like lifelong celibacy in an environment, a secular environment that idolizes sex, a church environment that idolizes marriage? And I'm like, yeah, that's tough, but that can't. I don't know. I don't want to form an ethical belief based on our social environment, right? That's not how ethics work. And yet at the same time, I'm like, yeah, we've kind of created an impossible environment for people to go without sex and marriage. I don't want to say impossible, but
that's right.
A difficult one. Would that be legitimate from a sociological perspective? That one's like, what if we were in an environment where the heroes of culture were all like monks, and where you have, I mean, as powerful as our sexuality is that enhanced by our environment? If we were in another environment, would it not be as raging and it's seemingly impossible to go without fulfilling their sexual desires?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think we don't talk about, something I've heard you talk about before, which I totally agree with, and is also a very Augustinian insight. And that is just that our desires for sex is really a desire for God and union, right? Like, so that's what it is. It's a desire for union. And if we helped people to have a range of forms of union besides just a sexual union, then that desire can be fulfilled in fruitful ways in all of life. I mean, with the amount of sex that people are having and sort of a sex-focused life, it's amazing how lonely people are,
yeah.
Right? It's like, this is just a huge epidemic, relationally, is that people are having a ton of sex and being lonely all the time because they're not thinking of sex as a form of union, like personal union, but they're also not pursuing union in ways outside of sexual relationships. So like deep forms of friendship, and of finding, mentors and walking the Christian life with other people. So ultimately, I think that desire is our desire for union with God and then union with the people of God. And so at least that's what Augustine wants us to say, is that it is a raging biological reality. There's no doubt about that. But when we interpret that from a Christian perspective, it actually gets transformed into this desire for personal union, which is a good thing. And that's what you're saying is, like, in our church social context, we oftentimes exclude people so that they're not actually building those deep friendships, having a relational union in other ways, but then we're telling them remain celibate. And it's like, we're really leaving them with no option at that point. But I don't think it's just because of the biological sexual desire. I think it has to do with that desire for personal union. Like, that has to be something that's fulfilled.
There's several gay friends of mine who are pursuing celibacy. I've often said, I could live without sex, but I can't live without love and intimacy. And until the church understands the difference, it's hard to live, right? So, and I would say the celibate gay friends that I can think of, their level of flourishing is deeply, I'm just thinking through different scenarios right now in my head, is their level of flourishing is intrinsically connected to two things. Number one, the level of intimacy they have with God, and the level of love and intimacy they have with other people in the body of Christ.
That's right.
And this is where and I like to say, every now and then, to drive home a point, I say something that might be a little over the top. People are like, yeah, you think? But like, simply having a traditional sexual ethic is inadequate without also supplementing that with fostering a community with deep love and intimacy. Like, it is, I don't want to say impossible. I don't want to shortchange the Holy Spirit, but the Holy Spirit also works in community. Like, to tell somebody to go and be celibate in 2022, when we idolize marriage in the church, idolize sex everywhere else, and say, but I'm not also going to, like, whether you can find intimacy or not my problem, just don't have sex. That just, it seems like an inadequate and incomplete and naive sexual ethic, I don't want to say it's not true. It's just incomplete.
I think that's right. I think that's true even for
straight married people.
If we even are thinking about married couples who are having sex, the thing is that I think their lives are incomplete without these other avenues of relationship as well. And so it's not just like, let's have some small groups, but it's like really thinking differently about what the church is, as this sort of supportive community of discipleship. And then that way we can welcome people who are going to, for whatever reason, sort of be single and walk in celibacy or whatever. That the thing is that we're welcoming them into a rich community of fellowship, and not just, they show up and sit next to some people and then go home and have to then like gut it out the rest of the week.
Yeah. Hey, I got another question. This is related, but a little off the topic. While I have you, you did your PhD on the image of God, right? That was your PhD.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
Okay. So,
and that's what got me into the identity stuff, because the title of my book is The Image of God as Human Identity.
Okay.
Where I'm trying to say this is a kind of a theological anchor for understanding everything else about ourselves.
So in Genesis 1:27, the first time we see image of God, one of the only times, the main one, in the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. I've often said that, without getting specific, our male and female sexed embodiment is somehow intertwined with bearing God's image. I've said that. Now I'm nervous saying that in front of you, just in case you're like, nah, you totally misunderstood the passage. I spent 3 years researching. Is that, would you say that? Would you reframe that? What do you think? What's the relationship between bearing God's image and our sexed embodiment?
Yeah. So the language actually that I would want to modify a little bit there is the idea of bearing the image of God, because I think that sometimes we think of like humanity as a thing that already exists, and then the image of God sort of stamped on top of that. And what I want to do is reverse that relationship, so that like God creates this cosmic temple, and then he places an image inside of that temple. That image is humanity. So then the question becomes, why does humanity have the form that it has? And everything follows from the image of God. So why are we both body and soul? Why are we both male and female? And why do we have the vocations of worshiping and imitating God, the vocation of friendship with other humans, and then the vocation of dominion over the earth? All of that follows because we're made in God's image. So instead of saying we're a thing that bears the image, it's more like we're the image.
We are the
image. Yeah. We are the image of God, and that dictates the form of life that we have. So then in that case, yes, being male and female is crucial to that. And I really think that is a sort of a built-in requirement, right, to seek out fellowship and union.
Yeah.
Because you can't actually do any of these other vocations without doing it together as man and woman, and especially if there's only one man and one woman at the beginning.
What does it say about God that we are in his image as male and female, when God doesn't have a biological sex, even though his revealed identity is primarily, exclusively male, even though he does have feminine metaphors that God also uses to describe himself, but he's also because that's it's easy for me to say our male and female sex embodiment is significant for being in God's image. But what does that say about God not being gendered or not being sexed? I don't like using the term genderless.
Well, it seems to me that God is the source of sex and gender, but not the it doesn't condition his life.
Okay.
So he transcends these things, right? And the reason we call God he is not because he's a big man or whatever, but instead it's because we have to use a personal pronoun, because God's not impersonal. He's not just a thing, right? He's personal. So, and then there's, in a sense, if you think about male in some ways as making, the man makes a woman fruitful in a certain way, there's kind of a sense in which God is the man, and all of us are female in this sense, that we're the ones who receive from God and are made fruitful by him. So to take the whole sexual analogy there to a spiritual analogy. And so it makes way more sense to talk about God as he. But it doesn't mean that he has a sex at all, or a gender, obviously. And so he's transcending that. Male and female come from that. And then there's like a creaturely analogy then in humankind to kind of give us these anchors that God's going to use for teaching us about himself. So like, what does it mean that he's the Father? What does it mean to call the Son, and so on? All of that, of course, is going to have an interplay with human relationships. So I think human life takes the form that it does so that there are rooted analogies that can help us understand who God is.
It does feel, Ryan, if I'm honest, a little patriarchal.
Yeah.
Like and maybe that's Scripture was written in a patriarchal culture. So these are the categories they would have understood, but there's still like, how come men get the pronouns that God uses? Or like, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. And there's so much beauty in that passage, not to diminish it, but it is the man who's in the category of Jesus there, and the woman, which, he washed feet, died for the person, so I mean, he's subverting the whole patriarchal skeleton that he's working within.
That's the thing. It's definitely, there's a sense in which there are these themes of initiative taking or whatever, maybe, but like you said, entirely the goals for that taking of initiative totally undermine the goals that would have been normal, as in the Roman environment, but basically in all human environments, right?
Do you think the idea
there is that Christ takes the initiative to give his life for someone, and that's the same thing that he's asking husbands to do for their wives.
If I never thought of this, I'm going to ask it because it's theology in raw. If the Bible was written in a culture that wasn't patriarchal but matriarchal, do you think they would have presented God as the matriarch?
Yeah.
Or even today, in more of like egalitarian West, where if Scripture is written today and we're adopting cultural norms that people can understand, it'd almost be like God would reveal himself as a parent duo or something, or I don't know, like it'd be kind of a like in the patriarchal culture that the Bible is written in, it only made sense that God was the father. But today it'd be like, ooh, that'd be a little bit like, those aren't the categories that would resonate with a lot of the people that we're trying to reach. I'm sure I'm missing something. I think
it seems to me
Wayne Grudem would spank me right now saying, no, there is something essential.
Yeah. I'm sure there's people who would freak out, but I mean, I like the question. But I think no matter how confusing like different cultures can sort of, in terms of the way that we address these questions of sex and gender, societies sort of put a different lens on that reality, but there's no way to overthrow that reality or to subvert it entirely, right? And so I think that, again, if human life is in some ways a sacrament, we might want to say, like a picture in physical terms of a spiritual reality, then I think that God's still going to reveal himself the way that he does, according to that reality, because then we can look back at ourselves and realize these truths that maybe we didn't even see prior to that. So, like the fact that the man needs the woman to be himself, from Genesis chapter 2, like he can't be himself without the woman. Again, that subverts a certain kind of like Lone Ranger male, hey, I can be anything I want, whenever I want, and just kind of charge ahead. And so it's like, no, like literally you're called into fellowship with another without whom you can't be who God wants you to be, right? And that doesn't, so to me, I think that he's teaching us through this, and therefore God's going to reveal himself that way anyway.
Well, in a sense, I mean, Genesis 1 and 2 is, I think, I know there's different readings on it, but it seems pretty egalitarian. And I'm not using the term in the sense of like women in ministry, whatever, but male and female bearing God or in the image of God. So that, and yet God still, and I'm not saying Genesis 1 and 2 weren't written in a certain culture, but man, the themes there seem to transcend that kind of patriarchal and right out of the gate challenge it. So the fact that God still reveals himself as he, him, father, yeah, I don't know.
And even using the plural in Genesis 1 that God says us.
Yeah.
So he doesn't just say I and he in that sense, but talks about us. Let us make humanity in our image. But then in chapter 2, the use of the term helper, which half the times it's used in the Old Testament, it refers to God. So they're the idea that the woman is the one without whom the man cannot succeed.
Right.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely elevating the role of.
To be clear, I don't think you're saying like man is incomplete without being married to a woman. You're saying just the existence of men and women together in community. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And that's where we could go back to our discussion before about like fellowship in the church. Like that's going to include single people. So it doesn't mean marriage, but what it does mean is men and women living life together. There's this great sermon that Karl Barth has where he basically is talking about like small groups and these sort of groups where people move out into only men and only women groups. And then he's like, who gives them the right to do that? Like, that's not from the Bible. The Bible doesn't say like, just could join a men's group or join a women's group. Like the Bible says men and women together. Like that's the life of discipleship.
Really? He talked about that. He talked about small group stuff in church.
He doesn't say small groups, but he describes that because that was happening in Germany at the time. And it's just amazing. Yeah, no, but he doesn't call them small groups. That's not like the German word to use or whatever. But the concept was already present there. It's like men hang out with men, women hang out with women. And that's not what we're called to in Scripture, right? We're called to live life together. Yeah. So that I think is very profound and a challenge to a lot of our instincts, right? Yeah. Like we do discipleship best when it's all men together or all women together. Wait, that's not biblical.
Was Karl Barth yelling? Nein, das ist nicht gut. Das ist nicht gut.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I looked all this up again because I had heard it and it hit me with such a kind of force. I was like, where is this? And then I dug the sermon up, but I didn't actually look at to whom the sermon was preached, so I'd have to check that out.
Hey man, I'll let you go. I took you over an hour. Well, thank you so much. It's great to kind of just think out loud through these categories as somebody who's thought through it from a much deeper angle than I have. So I'm going to finish Brubaker's article and then yours and I'll probably shoot you an email with some thoughts as I work through this.
Sounds good. Well, I really appreciate you having me on, Preston. It's been great hanging out with you.
Yeah, a little shout out to Talbot Seminary. Any you want to give any free advertisement on what you guys are doing down there?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we have just obviously we're the seminary at Biola University and have just a spectacular faculty here. So any of you who are looking for seminary training, we'd love to have you as students in our MA, MDiv programs, and also those of you who want to like get into classic sources like Augustine. We have a fairly new, like a 3-year-old program called the MA in Classical Theology, where we're reading all the theological classics as the curriculum for the program. So that's a really exciting one.
How would you describe you've been in different educational institutions. What's the flavor, the distinction of Talbot Seminary? How would you describe it in ways that are this is kind of if you come here, you're going to get this and you might not get this kind of flavor somewhere else.
Yeah. I mean, what I love about what we're doing is we're intentionally and sort of determined to be biblical. So constantly going back to Scripture to figure out like, how do we sort through these things? But we're also culturally engaged on questions like the ones that you're constantly working on. Yeah. So it's not like we're biblical in the sense of like, we go back to, what culture was like 100 years ago, but it's like, no, how do we live well as Christians today? Mm-hmm. Which is good preparation for pastors, obviously, here in Southern California. People are facing that in their churches. But then 2 other distinctives that I'd mention. One of them is our spiritual formation focus, because we're really committed to the idea that you can't pastor a church unless you yourself are walking faithfully with God. So it's not like you just learn skills to preach, but you're actually involved in your own spiritual formation. We have courses dedicated to it, but they include things like spiritual direction and ways of thinking about their personal discipleship. And then another thing is our philosophy program here has really been a leading program. But because of that, you're always sort of, students, no matter what program they're in, are rubbing shoulders with philosophers who are approaching a lot of today's questions in a different way, with a different sort of artillery for addressing those questions. And so it leads to really, really great integrative discussion among the students. So I'd say like our biblical focus, the commitment to spiritual formation, and then also to philosophy are really key.
You seem to culturally very aware, and I know other schools that are too. But I think being in Southern California does give you a unique. Southern California is kind of on the leading edge of where culture is or is going. So just I would imagine that social environment does shape kind of the flavor of the classroom even. And you have a bunch of professors that surf, I think. So that's an added plus.
That's right, exactly. We get in the ocean a lot.
Surfing professors.
Yeah, it is. It's been really a delight to be on the faculty here. And so I feel that way. Like I'm blown away every semester. I start my classes by having students talk about kind of what they're up to in life. And I'm just blown away by our student body in terms of like the ministries that they're doing, but the lives that they're living, and the work that they're doing here. And then they're getting that training, taking it right back out. Yeah. Either in Southern California, or we have a growing online student body as well. And I'm just really, really appreciate the students I get to work with, but also all my colleagues, just fantastic people.
Yeah. I remember I was there, when was that, a year ago?
Yeah.
For like 2 days, but man, they had me running ragged. It was like 8 a.m. to like, you guys had some late night chapel I spoke at after speaking all day, the 2 days straight. It was probably the most I've ever spoken at 2 days, but I loved both the colleagues, the faculty, which I feel like I know half the faculty there personally. But then the students were just really enjoyed the student body, asking really good questions. And they were very honest. Like they were like, I just really enjoyed interacting with them. So,
I would say that that's been one of the most refreshing parts about being here, is that there really is an openness to saying, hey, we're all wanting to follow Jesus, but we're also all facing our own difficulties and struggles in that. Let's be honest about it and work together on, living for Jesus well. So it's a pretty remarkable context.
Good. All right, man. Hey, thanks for being on the show. Appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate you. Thanks.
This show is part of the Converge Podcast Network.
Hey friends, I just want to invite you to consider joining the Theology Mirada Patreon community. This is a group of followers who believe in the ministry and work of Theology Mirada and want to support it financially. And honestly, I've been so impacted by the people who have chosen to support this podcast. Every month they send in a bunch of questions. A lot of them are really personal, and I get to spend time responding to them in a private podcast. And we, we'll message each other throughout the month and post responses to each other's questions. I'm actually going to start something new this fall, a monthly live Zoom chat with some of the members. And I'm super looking forward to actually seeing more of their faces every month. And there's other perks that come up, like, they all get free a free virtual pass to the Theology in Raw Exiles in Babylon conference every year. But honestly, I don't want to make it sound transactional. Every single Patreon member that I've talked to says the same thing. We like all the perks. We're thankful for them, but we're just more thankful to support the ministry of Theology in the Raw, and we're glad to do so. So if this is you, if you've been impacted by Theology in the Raw, you can join the Theology in the Raw community for a minimum of $5 a month by going to patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. That's patreon.com/Theology in the Raw. The link is in the show notes.